I'll apologise in advance for the lack of any slides. Michael will be putting some references into the chat box, and I'm happy to have follow-up discussions. As some of you may know from reading my recent CVSL blog, Trying to Sustain Practice in a Shifting Landscape of Uncertainty, I am concerned about sustainability, in particular related to voluntary community and social enterprise agencies. I've been invited here today to share my perspective. I don't label myself an expert, but I am someone with a set of skills and insights distilled from working in and with public, private, voluntary and community organisations, and running two businesses for more than 25 years, education and training, property restoration and management. I have been very fortunate to have been able to blend two of my areas of interest, education and construction. This has precipitated collaborative working arrangements delivering diverse skills training and resulting in more than £1 million worth of capital projects, community gardens, cafes, housing association, wellness spaces, the list goes on. I have involved individuals and agencies in what were often challenging initiatives comprised of complex funding arrangements, multi-sector, multi-agency partnership working, skills and job opportunity initiatives, signposting and support. Central to all of these has been the need to widen participation, build capacity, facilitate more sustainable and resilient communities. For me, sustainability implies continuity, consistency, and communication. Those are my 3 C's. It needs to be authentic and holistic. It's looking for the long term rather than just focusing in on the short term. What it is not is isolationist. Sustainability is not an add-on. It needs to be a critical and integral part of all enterprises, individual or collective, small or large, and woven into the very fabric of what organisations say and do. From business planning to beneficiaries, from strength of leadership to strategy, from income to impact. To be sustainable, any business needs to develop the capacity within itself through building knowledge and skill sets to developing strategies to counter adverse factors and to resist what has become a default setting for many enterprises, short-termism, and the act of heightened firefighting. Let's face it, we've all had too much of that. The issue with a short-termism approach is that it often results in poor planning, hurried business decision-making, employee and volunteer dissatisfaction, and ultimately impacts on sustainability and resilience. The result can be what was important becomes urgent and the cycle continues. This is not a sustainable position for any business in any sector. So whilst talking sustainability, I mentioned resilience. The two are compatible concepts, but they are not the same thing. When we talk resilience, we are exploring our ability to bounce back after disaster, natural, economic, or other. Resilience is often described as the ability to recover quickly, but recovery alone is not an adequate goal. Truly resilient organisations bounce back better and even thrive. They develop systems that help them to both anticipate and to mitigate potential disruptions. They help others to do so by sharing knowledge and practice insights. So an ideal community, economy, or business will be both sustainable and resilient. They cannot exist without the other. By adopting sustainability and resilience practices, any business can contribute positively to local economic, social, and environmental dynamics. This communicates into stronger working relationships between agencies, more engaged residents contributing their time and energy to volunteering, engaging or re-engaging in the local skills and labour market, joining courses, supporting the local independent retailers, taking a pride in greening and maintaining their area. The list goes on. For me, this is part of the creative matrix of sustainable communities, organisations, and individuals. Allow me to take a mouthful of water. Over the past 18 months, having travelled the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, to be exact, 12,245 miles, in my motorhome from Dunnet Head to Lizard Point, I've had the pleasure of talking with a variety of people, from independent business owners to community cafe volunteers. I've often been in remote areas such as the Outer Hebrides on Harris and Lewis, the Orkneys, Royal Estates in Ballater and Norfolk to southerly coastal villages. Yes, there may well be a coffee book at some point in the future. But for the moment, what I take away from all these experiences, as diverse as they have been, is what sustainability and reliance looks like. To me, it looks like collective agency. I have seen example after example of creative and innovative initiatives with long-term objectives. I was very inspired to learn about the Outer Hebrides Leader Programme, which is 782 projects, result in a programme of activities worth £34.5 million to the local economy. Sustainability has been central to these initiatives, and it has made an enormous difference to people living and working in rural and island communities of the United Kingdom, of which we have many. It feeds into policy making, it feeds into research. And after learning about and staying for some time there, I really felt I wanted to move to the Outer Hebrides. There are so many examples I could talk about. So why do we need to look up, step up, and grasp the subject of investing in sustainability by the collar? I think it is more urgent than ever that we facilitate conversations which feed into action. Let me share a few examples of the current context, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. This April saw the publication of the Charities Aid Foundation's UK Giving Report. It highlighted a significant reduction in terms of levels of donation, volunteering, and sponsorship compared with pre-COVID-19 levels. This represents an estimated 4.9 million fewer people donating to charity. In May this year, the Bank of England said that £4.6 billion more had been withdrawn from Bank and Building Society accounts than had been paid into them. This represents the highest level since records began 26 years ago, perhaps an indication of people raiding their savings. Not everyone has savings to raid. The charity Step Change suggests that this is the latest in a long line of warnings as more people struggle with the cost of living. What concerns me is the short to long-term effects of the conflation of these and other elements. And let me not get started on taxation. So I'll turn my attention to the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which the UK was at the forefront of negotiating. You only need to skim read the UK government's corporate report implementing the Sustainable Development Goals to see how many of the embedded planning activities involve VCSE agencies in their delivery. Given what we know is happening, how can that be deemed to be a sustainable position? Given that we are only just emerging post-COVID, we're still in a cost of living crisis, and many organisations are still in the reactionary position and worried about their future. Any organisation at some point needs to recalibrate its direction in order to gain a clear perspective that is appropriate to that organisation. This could be a question of fine-tuning, or it could be to explore a more radical transformation of its services and how it delivers them. All these aspects need to be integrated. The outcome should ensure that change can take place and that the organisation is prepared to adapt to the new situation, the new challenges, and new opportunities. Now, as a small business owner myself, I have done just that. I've had to make several significant changes to my business models over the past few years, some of which have been as a direct result of policy implications that can impact disproportionately on smaller enterprises, be them for profit or not for profit. Now, we know change happens whether we like it or not. But what we do need to do is focus or refocus on the need to grow people, the need to grow agency, to grow our collective ability to be sustainable on so many levels, from nano to macro. Facilitating and cultivating a sustainability and resiliency mindset needs to be the key focus. Understanding what this looks like takes thinking and supportive structures to enable it. I believe organisations such as business schools are in an ideal position to develop and disseminate supportive structures through their extended arms of co-production. For me, this is an iterative process, like ripples in the water. When you drop the stone in, they get bigger. We need to embrace the concepts and actualise the practice collectively. There really is no viable alternative to building a truly sustainable future for ourselves. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. Bang on time, I have to say. So congratulations for that. Thank you for opening the session up with a very thought-provoking presentation. Just one word of warning, Outer Hebrides, watch out for the midges. It's beautiful, but the midges are terrible.
I went prepared with every spray, including the one that our army actually take with them on manoeuvres.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm not going to pause for questions yet, but I wonder if you, I do have one which you might want to sort of take into consideration. I'm sure people might be interested in you expanding on your 3 C's of sustainability, but perhaps we can come back to that after we've heard from our second presenter, who is Christopher Mann, who is a hedge fund manager with Columbia Threadneedle. Columbia Threadneedle, easy for you to say. Christopher, over to you. I believe you may have some slides to share with us.
That's right, Liz, and thank you very much for that introduction, and really interesting, Helen, some of your comments you just made, many of which I will actually be touching on in my section. But to introduce myself, I'm a fund manager in the city. Been working in financial markets for about 25 years, and in that 25-year time, issues around sustainability have grown and grown, and there's lots of reasons why we have that growing interest in sustainable investing. Partly it's regulatory scrutiny, partly it's legal requirements, but most importantly, the one that's driving it all is ultimately client interest. And client interest has massively expanded over the 25-year period. And I guess the element I want to talk about today is to highlight that this shouldn't be seen as a cost or a burden or a bad thing. This should be seen instead as something which can, in the right way, be a win-win. And more and more evidence as time goes by is that responsible investing, about thinking about many of the long-termism that Helen would have just mentioned, is actually what investors want, and actually in the long term ends up rewarding them. And perhaps there is a contrary example which we can use to demonstrate why short-termism is bad, and that is, of course, is Thames Water. And everything about Thames Water has been bad for all stakeholders, not just for customers, not just the environment, but also ultimately the shareholders. And I think that is very interesting. It might be an example we want to come back to in the questions. But I guess the key contention that I want to talk about is this idea that investing from a sustainable point of view is another expression of investing from a quality point of view. And the reason why that is important is because financial markets for many, many years have always been willing to pay a premium for quality. Financial markets have always been willing to pay a premium for quality. And the idea that sustainability is another sort of way of looking at quality, I think, is very interesting. And it's the way through which investors end up being the winners. So in other words, companies which have stable and predictable cash flows, they're able to command valuation premiums, and companies like mine spend a lot of time and effort trying to push companies up the quality curve. And in terms of engaging with companies on their a corporate responsibility in terms of engaging with companies on their environmental, social, and governance commitments, firms like mine will spend a lot of time working with companies that they are shareholders in, companies that they own parts of, trying to share best practice. Typically, that will look at things like, for instance, measuring carbon footprinting, measuring carbon footprints not just for the direct consumables of a company, but also the consumables behind the whole supply chain. That's quite complex to do, but is very important to do it in a fair way for all members of the of an industry group. Then companies like mine will typically, once they have frameworks in place to look at carbon footprints, ensure that targets are being set by companies and making sure that executive remuneration, for instance, is aligned to achieving those targets. And that's the typical way that sort of the engagement piece is done in finance. But the bit I want to talk about today is to prove this idea, or demonstrate at least, that this can be a win-win. And I've got a few slides which approach this not from a company by company point of view, not from the so-called bottom-up perspective, but from the top-down perspective, which means going country by country. And if I can just share my screen, hopefully you'll be able to see it. Does that come through? Great, brilliant. So again, what I put on the slide here is the conventional wisdom when I started out 25 years ago about what to look for in financial markets. In other words, the conventional wisdom of you want to be investing in countries which have high economic growth, because that high economic growth is going to lead to revenue growth of your companies, greater profits, greater dividends. And if you cast your minds back perhaps 20 years or so, the buzzword in the industry was the BRICS. The BRICS, they were called: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And nowhere in that statement on the slide is the question of sustainability. Nowhere on that slide is the question of governance. And so these kind of truisms that economic growth was what it was all about were bandied about in the industry. And what I wanted to look at is whether there is any sort of proof statements to these concepts of economic growth leading to revenue growth. So on the next page, I have marked up for a variety of different countries their GDP growth on the horizontal axis and their listed sector revenue growth on the vertical axis. In other words, if it was true that high economic growth led to high revenue growth for the corporates, everything should be on the one-to-one line. And I've marked that one-to-one line as a black line going up the middle. And you can see that towards the left-hand side, most countries are somewhere to do with the black line, but towards the right-hand side of the picture, there are quite a few countries where you start to see a bit of slippage. And what I mean by this slippage is the country is delivering GDP growth, but the companies which investors are investing in aren't necessarily capturing revenue growth. There is slippage between the two. And when I go on to the next slide, it's exactly the same slide. I've just added one more country, and you'll probably be able to guess where I'm going with this, because I've added one more country to exactly the same slide. It's Russia. Russia, over that period of 1995 to 2018, saw incredible GDP growth, but very, very little benefited the end investors. Only about a quarter of that growth ended up benefiting investors. And you can probably guess what my next slide is going to be, which is to hypothesize why some countries aren't on that one-to-one line, why that conventional wisdom doesn't always hold. And it is to do with, in this case, corruption. And on the previous slide, that gap between the fair line, the one-to-one relationship, is what I call the slippage, and I've marked it as the vertical on this slide. And on the horizontal axis, I have the corruption index from the World Bank, and you can see that generally speaking, the more corrupt a country is on the World Bank index, the less likely that GDP growth ends up benefiting investors. And that sort of truism which I started out with, where 20 years ago you wanted to be investing in the BRICS, the Brazils, the Russias, the Indias, the Chinas, they never mentioned this question of governance quality. They never mentioned the ability for those corporates to capture any of that growth. And last February, we saw a tragic invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Russia was the outlier on one of my earlier slides, which looks so poor. And we all know what happened to the Russian stock market, which collapsed down to zero. That's the end of my slides, but it's essentially the point I'm trying to make there is just like Thames Water, if you don't put this front and center, if you don't put, as Helen said, long-termism front and center, it's not just bad outcomes for the environment and the community and the general population. It's also bad outcomes for investors, and that's really the kind of the point that I want to end on.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating to look at those numbers and graphs there, Christopher. Thank you so much for that. Loads of questions coming in my head, but we're going to move to our third panelist now. So Dr. Anya Schaefer, again, a colleague of mine from the Department of Public Leadership and Social Enterprise. So Anya, would you like to do your own introduction and share your thoughts, please?
Yes, thank you, Liz. And thank you, Helen and Christopher, for your previous presentations. That was fascinating to listen to. I haven't got a presentation, I haven't got any slides, but I will talk a little bit about what we are doing in the business school and where I think the role of a business school could be, and our business school in particular should be, in terms of sustainability. I have been working on business and sustainability related themes since 1996, when ironically enough, I started on a project that was looking at we didn't call it that way, environmental management in the then very recently privatized water and electricity utilities in the UK. Now, Thames Water wasn't part of it, but when I started out with the research, they had just been privatized, or fairly recently been privatized, and they were still mostly in the hands of the small investors who had first chance of buying them, but you could see how they were being sold off to large international investors. And I think this is, Thames Water is a particularly stark example of what's happened there. And I'm not going to go in it. We've all read it in the news. And if you haven't, and you want a bit of a tragedy, then do read up on it in the news. And I've stayed with that theme of business and environmental sustainability ever since. I've done other bits. I've looked at organizational ethics. I've looked at various topics around this, and I have supervised several PhD students, 2 of whom are here today, who have been looking at sustainability in business organizations, small and large. I've also taught this stuff in various forms, so it's been my mission to write some of it into some of our modules for years now, and so it so has been the mission of some of my colleagues. So it turns out we actually have quite a lot of it, but we could do a lot more with it. So I've looked at the themes and I'm going to talk to them, although not necessarily in the order that they came through in the invite. I think the challenges are absolutely enormous, and they apply to all social actors, and that includes both private sector, but also public and voluntary sector organizations. Climate change and biodiversity loss are the two, or nature loss, I think I'd like to call it, are two of the overarching themes, and a lot of the other themes that we have, like pollution, etc., they can be discussed under those two major topics. So decarbonisation is an absolutely urgent and highly urgent, not highly urgent, highly important. See, that comes from not writing these things down. You repeat yourself. So it's one of the major challenges for industry, but also for other social actors. So carbon intensive industries is by no means only transport or energy consumption. There is a lot of hidden carbon, for example, in agriculture, in construction. So the industry sectors we don't necessarily think of, which are nonetheless really high on the list, and it's very challenging. And then reducing resource and land use for human consumption. So there is some left over for an intact nature on which we ultimately all depend. The lack of insects this spring has been very observable to my mind, and it's scary. It really is scary. But at the same time, we also have the challenges of growing more food for a growing world population. I've just attended a panel discussion on the future of agriculture and how this is supposed to happen. I think the views amongst agriculturists are actually widely divergent, but that it is an urgent issue is recognized. We need to provide decent livelihoods for a growing world population. So people need to be able to earn money or to live and to eat and to house and to bring up families in a decent environment. And all of this is happening while we're seeing significant new geopolitical challenges. And of course, you know, the whole situation with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, but there are wars going on in a lot of different countries, a lot of different continents. China is acting in quite an aggressive way, so that absorbs a lot of attention. Not just for governments, but also for businesses. So every business investing, you know, global players, they have really urgent questions they are asking themselves about the financial sustainability of where they are investing. So that brings us back to the question of what do we mean by sustainability? The Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs, have been mentioned already, and they are set up for those who are, I should imagine most people are familiar with them. So just to summarize, a set of 17 overarching goals. And I think the crucial bit is that each of these has a range of targets and indicators associated with it. And that is where the challenge is for, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, about the business school curriculum. It's not enough to vaguely relate to one of the overarching goals, but one really should ask oneself, how does it relate to the targets and indicators? And obviously, so my concern has mostly been with private sector organizations. So that's what I speak to about, or speak to most commonly. But this applies to public and voluntary sector organizations as well. And they obviously have played a major role in creating some of the problems in the first place. But they also have an important role in addressing the issues. You know, it cannot be done without private sector organization, with all the, you know, community efforts in the world. At the moment, a lot of global action is happening through private sector organizations. So as long as they continue to operate in the way they do, and they're not taking on the long-term investment strategies that Christopher's been talking about, then, you know, community action in and of itself, it's not going to do it. Public sector action in and of itself is not going to do it. The question of how we should be defining sustainability has arisen we've been running two sustainability workshops in the faculty or in the business school, and we're running a third one next week. Some of you obviously are familiar with this and our guests are not, and no worries, I'm not going to talk in detail about them. And whenever I'm asked about this, I am coming back to a very early definition of, or the early 3 pillars of sustainability, which are environmental / ecological, social and economic, where economic does mean quite a lot more than just long-term financial viability of individual organizations. Obviously, the whole thing of decent livelihoods, people being able to support themselves comes into that, and then cannot be looked at in isolation either. I mean, you sometimes have to look at one of them just so you get traction on something, but they are intricately linked, but they're not necessarily entirely compatible. So there are certain questions that we need to pursue around environmental and ecological sustainability in terms of biodiversity, in terms of nature recovery, which are, at least on a local level, in contradiction with questions of food production, timber production. Yeah, so it's not that they necessarily reinforce each other. So what can and should business schools do? And now I'm not summarizing just my own thoughts, but those that came up through the workshops that we had. So the one we haven't talked about yet as a part of a workshop, but does obviously revolve around the knowledge creation, the research that we do. And we should be doing a lot of research, and probably more research, or maybe even most of our research should be focusing on question of sustainability issues and sustainability actions in organizations. That's my personal view. That's not necessarily an agreed in the faculty yet. We probably should also stop teaching and researching stuff that actually contributes to unsustainable practices. And there are other people who can talk more about it. There have been books written about it, about how we shouldn't be teaching this stuff and we shouldn't be doing that stuff. And other people have said it much better than I have, so I'm going to skip this bit. And then we should really look at what we teach and how we help students develop skills that help them to be sustainability-oriented managers who can instigate, can start sustainability action in their organizations, because that's tough and it requires both knowledge and skills. So some of the discussions have been, well, it isn't really about knowledge, but I think it is also about knowledge, because I don't think you can manage something about which you don't have at least a basic working knowledge. If you don't have a basic understanding of questions of sustainability, questions of ecology, and how these things work together, I don't think you can manage something that you know nothing about. It's a bit like, well, this might in fact be a controversial view, but coming from a German background, I would also fully support the idea that in order to successfully manage an organization, you need to understand what that organization does. You need to understand its products and services and its customers. You're not going to do it otherwise. And the same applies to sustainability. You need to know something. But just knowledge is also not enough. There are probably skills which they're transferable skills. They're not skills you don't need in management otherwise. But how we make those bear on questions of sustainability, I think that is something that all business schools could probably do with thinking about a bit more. And then what business schools probably also need to do, no, not probably, what they definitely also need to do, I think, Christopher, you've talked about collaboration, and certainly Helen, you've talked about collaboration quite a bit. And we need to collaborate not just for, big ticket research projects that allow us to bring in lots of money, but we also need to collaborate both within universities. There are other parts of a university that deal with these issues on a very regular basis, and sometimes they don't talk with us, we don't talk with them enough. And there are a lot of stakeholders outside that we should probably talk about sustainability issues with. So what has come out of the workshops, very tentative so far, but I feel I can share this with both colleagues and guests at the time, is that we talked about students and we talked about curriculum. These two things are obviously not things anyway. Students are not things, students are people. But these two topics are linked, of course they are. But one out of the first workshop came questions around how we can help or we can support students to become better managers for sustainability. And that maybe there needs to be stuff that's outside of our modules. How can we make them part of a sustainability oriented academic community? I slightly hesitate to use the term communities of practice, because I know there's a lot of academic background to what that actually means. But I think if we use it at a common sense kind of thing, how can our students become more effective managers of a sustainability community of practice? And maybe there are extracurricular things, maybe there are pathways, maybe there are links to external accreditations. Another colleague has just made me aware of two things that we might be, or two external frameworks we might be using for that. And I've not looked into it enough yet, so I'm not just throwing them into the room now. And the thing of highlighting sustainability-oriented pathways through the curriculum, particularly at the OU with our big fat modules, where we don't particularly work through short credits. Well, we do short credits as well, but for the qualifications, we have modules that pick up sustainability themes here and there. How can we show the students what the pathway is? How do we understand ourselves what the pathway is? And so one of the other outcomes is that to look at the stuff that we already have in our curriculum. I think this is probably true for a lot of other business schools. What is there already? Does it link up? Because we probably don't know enough of how it links up. Does it link up in a way that tells a story or that develops a sustainability pathway in a way that we're happy with? And then how do we become happier with that? How do we strengthen that? And so that's a little bit of, as I said, it's a little bit for internal consumption, this one. But if you work at a different institution, no doubt you can take some of it away. At the Open University, we very rarely work top down. So there is a lot of top down stuff, but how it really happens is usually bottom up. But then that leads to a lot of stuff happening in different modules and different research projects. And how can we tell ourselves, our students, and the world at large, the story of what is happening, and bring them into that story, saying, like, where does that story go? Where does that development go? So this is where we're at. This is what the story we've got. This is the contribution we're making so far. What contribution should we be making? Where do you want us to go?
Thank you, Anya.
I'm shutting up now.
Well, I'd like to be the first to say thank you very much to all three panelists. I think everybody would agree that the passion for this subject certainly came through it in them all, in the different ways, and it's been an absolutely fascinating all-round view of the subject matter. Michael, I promised I would go first to the chat and see if we have any questions from our contributors. Do you have any that are an obvious one to ask?
There's no question yet in the chat, but if you don't mind, I can have a first go.
You're the boss.
And hopefully that triggers something. So I was just interested in how do organizations demonstrate evidence of sustainability? That what from your respective experiences, what are the tools out there that you have been using or the organizations you have been working with use to demonstrate both to their stakeholders but also to the wider society that they are indeed taking sustainability seriously.
Can we maybe ask that first to you, Christopher, because I think you might have something from our earlier conversation, and then maybe come to Helen and Anya if she wants to contribute too. Thanks, Christopher.
Yes, absolutely. This is a big topic in my industry, and as I indicated, we get an increasing amount of questions from clients, from regulators, from all sorts of different types on what we're doing on this. And my company takes this very, very seriously. We have a team of 42 people just engaging with different companies that we are shareholders in, that we're unit holders in, and helping them in that transition, helping them understand what our priorities are for where they should put their effort, helping them understand what we want, and ultimately threatening to vote in a certain way at the annual general meeting if they don't. So that's a bit essentially the sort of high level picture. It is also traditional these days to ask fund managers like me, what is your carbon footprint of your portfolio, and other questions which 10 years ago would just never have been or very rarely asked. So all that is the sorts of things that we would do. And I mentioned carbon footprinting. It's a big topic, and how you measure that both for individual companies, for industries, how you set targets, how you reward or have potentially demerits if you miss those targets. All of that is a big topic. Another example of the same sort of thing is in, say, deforestation. Where many firms will be exposed to deforestation type risks. Many firms will be exposed to that as an issue. It could be a building supplier firm. It doesn't just have to be the logging firms. It could be a sort of Home Depot type of company. And one of the things that we do in that case is we try and build a database of where the risks lie for the whole supply chain. That information is often very fragmented. Often it is best to stitch together different databases to get that picture, and then we'll go to the appropriate companies that have interest in that and who may not have been able to do that themselves. And we can show them this picture and potentially even ask them to incorporate that picture into their own targets, maybe even ask them as an industry group to start to think about it. And as a whole supply chain, us with other firms can put pressure on these sorts of topics. So yes, we are now very much involved in the demonstration of putting sustainability into practice. And as I said with my remarks, I think that the whole tone of the conversation has changed over the last 25 years from seeing this as something of a cost, a sort of another compliance type of angle, to actually seeing something which can be rewarding, not just from doing the right thing, but also rewarding ultimately of building your companies to be more resilient, to have better supply chains, to have a better understanding of the risks to them. Helen mentioned in her comments resilience, this kind of resilience question. It's all about those sorts of topics and understanding where the risks are and helping the companies that we own adapt.
Thank you. Helen, did you want to come in with something?
Yes, I just brought upon the 3 C's when you talk about ways of sort of looking at your own business and keeping an eye on different aspects in terms of sustainability. One of mine, I suppose, a little matrix is the 3 C's. continuity, consistency, and communication. And probably easier to illustrate this with an example, because I actually had to invoke this last week. It was brought to my attention that one of our contractors on our rental properties, who's been servicing the fire alarm system, especially in the blocks of flats for, well, I think since 2006, had a change of director, who I had the pleasure, inverted commas, to have a communication with last year, when I made it clear to him that I was exceptionally informed about the regulations, because I keep up to date myself, and that I knew that they only needed to actually inspect 50% of the building, each building, and that goes over the year. So over the whole of the year, then you get the whole building inspected in terms of setting off the fire alarm and checking the sensors, blah, blah, blah. But I said that whilst that is the regulation, we like to go above that. We like to make sure that on every 6-month visit, that the fire alarm system that operates in all the rental units within a block of flats is checked. To me, that was a small extra price to pay. And as a business, I was quite prepared to pay that. And that was agreed. And of course, what's happened in the last few weeks is the new director has done all his contracts to the letter of the law, with very poor communication to us. And this was brought to my attention by somebody that works for us, who supervises these, but I have the ultimate decision on contractors. And I just had one of my special conversations, as I call them, that actually highlighted the change in their continuity and consistency of service, a reduction in the quality and appropriateness of their communication. And I gave them the opportunity, because I'm all into the second chance, of actually correcting that. They chose not to do what really I would have expected them to do. So on the basis of that, I terminated our contract with them immediately, and now we have a new contractor. Because what I won't do, and I think this is where you have to be really firm, is to have anything that actually compromises safety and sustainability of the service and the standard, that we look to offer going forward. And of course, some of that is obviously dependent on other people who are your contractors. And the thing that concerns me, and I did put that in a letter to basically his father, who's just retired, who set the business up, to say that we've always had a very good relationship. And I worry for his company going forward in terms of their sustainability, because reputation takes a long time to build up, but boy, can it actually be eroded in a relatively short period of time with particular types of actions. And in certain industries, let's face it, safety, there's none of that, second chance. So that's my sort of one of my matrices. There are others, but that's one I wanted to share. And just actually connecting with Christopher's comments with his wonderful, I love graphs, and I was disappointed but not surprised to see where the South African ZAR is. I know South Africa very well. I've been traveling there for a quarter of a century. We have a house in the middle of nowhere along the western seaboard, and we've spent a quarter of a century of interacting with being part of the village, which is 7 kilometers down the road. So that's very close in South African terms. And I've done a lot of, and still do a lot of, charity work out there. In fact, I'm out there at the end of this year for a solid month to develop some of our initiatives. And of course, what concerns me is what I've seen over the years is obviously big companies like Eskom that supply the energy. So many places around South Africa are into level 8 emergency energy. I've got people that I know who have invested. They're fortunate they have the money to do that in inverters. They've done everything sustainable. There's a lot of sunshine out there. So yes, you can put a lot of solar panels and generate electricity, but there's a lot of people that do not and will not have that capacity to do that. I've seen expansions of what are called the informal settlements as more people migrate down from different parts of South Africa to places outside Cape Town, or indeed from Africa as a continent down towards South Africa. And just over that, with that long lens and what we see and the challenges that have been precipitated and exacerbated by COVID, I'm exceptionally concerned about the sustainability going forward. I'll just give you one, if you don't mind, just one very quick example, a conversation before COVID with one of our farmers around where we have property. He has literally thousands of acres. He has 660 head of cattle. He's primarily a dairy farmer. And we were sitting sort of at the end of a very long day and all chatting, and he said, we've got some really, really difficult decisions to make. He said, how can it be that it's costing me, a small dairy farmer, more money to produce milk than it is that I'm getting in revenue? He said, he certainly did the calculations. That year, they had to rush to create cash crops in spare fields just to actually balance the books. And the intermediaries in all those processes are taking a cut, but the actual ultimate place for that milk is obviously the supermarkets. And over there, it's like our Tesco's and Sainsbury's, and they were pushing the price down, and it was just trickling down to the fact is that the people actually producing the product, weren't actually covering their costs of actually producing it to the safety standards that were required. Not a sustainable position. So
thank you. Thanks very much, Helen. Anya, did you want to add anything to that, or do we have another question? You want to move to another question?
Move to another question if
Okay.
you have one.
I do. Olga, would you like to ask your question?
Hi everyone. I just don't want to jump if someone else, Lizzie, go ahead, so I can ask then a question later.
No,
don't worry.
I'm looking at the chat, Michael. I can't see another question. So Olga, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi everyone. My name is Olga Andrianova. I'm a lecturer in management at the DPO. It's a Department of People and Organization at the Open University, and my PhD was on corporate greening. It's actually, Christopher, similar to your corporate world. However, I focused on the chemical industry. So it was interesting to see how a lot of frontline managers and actually normal ordinary people struggled actually to implement the strategic goals and strategic approaches what the senior managers actually set, and then what issues they struggled had to implement different legislation goals, etc. So that's why I'm really, really pleased to see a lot of issues you have raised here, like, for example, Helen, in your case, resilience. The frontline managers also had the similar difficulties to create or to develop abilities to design special practices to tackle with to tackle the different issues associated with the legislations. And Anya, also in your case, also the importance of knowledge, simple knowledge about environmental issues are quite significant or contribute a lot to implement this kind of strategic approaches. So I just wanted to ask the question regarding a general approach, what we have, or the theme, what we have during the webinar, investing in sustainability. And what I hear from all the contributions now, that actually we can fine-tune the word sustainability in different so like investing in technical solutions, like Christopher, you mentioned, also investing in people, investing in relations, and investing in collaborations, because without collaboration, it's quite difficult to address different specific sustainability issues across the industries. I'm just wondering, we have discussed that the sustainability is environmental, economic, and social, or cover social issues. but collaboration is also about time, investing time in those collaboration. And I feel that the concept of sustainability also missing this element, because particularly after pandemic, the whole set of our working, communicating has been changed. I'm just wondering if this kind of collaboration should be rethought in a different way, how we can foster actually collaboration between industries, between, like Anya, you mentioned, between our departments, between people. Even now, if I would like to contact Helen again, because I'm also trying to get into, to solve any problems, it's quite difficult. I need to go through a particular barriers. So my question is, what would be your vision about methods, options to foster such collaboration towards sustainability? Maybe a very complex issue, question, but just
Thank you.
Like maybe to elaborate.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I don't think I'll be able to paraphrase that. So I'm hoping that our panelists, we're talking about collaboration here and whether or not that's something that should actually be, if not enforced, then certainly something that's seen as part and parcel of what good sustainability looks like. Would that be a way to ask the question, Olga? It should be part and parcel of what we're looking at in that. And I think, since Anya, I'm going to come to you first, since you did mention that as one of the skills, particularly that we might be wanting to address in for students. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any great wisdom to impart there, because if there's one thing I've learned from the communication with some of our colleagues in the department, not least Professor Steve Wangen, who spent decades looking at this, is that it's bloody difficult. You know, collaboration is hard, and particularly formal collaborative arrangements fail more often than they succeed. And part of the issue is, I'm not going to paraphrase her research here, but certainly one of the things that I've noticed myself is that the sheer effort and time that it takes on all sides. And I think that was part of what Olga was referring to. And you've also referenced the changed ways of working. And that's an interesting point, because on the one hand, online working allows us to be in this virtual room together where we can hear our different views. However, it's not the same type of conversation that we would have if we were all in the same place, and afterwards we'd be going for lunch together and we'd keep having these conversations. So, but that's not specifically sustainability related. That's just a beef I'm having with online stuff, full stop. So to be honest, Liz, I thank you for asking me, but I actually genuinely do not know the answer to it. As an individual, I'd say putting oneself out there, trying to make the connections, and outside the university as well. I think that's really important, because a lot of connections are happenstance. They're things that just sort of occur, and suddenly you see this is somebody who's really useful to talk to or to talk with, and I just happen to run across them because I happen to be in the right place at the right time. So there may be people who have advice on how one does this properly. So I actually don't know how to develop this in our students. I just threw it out that it's probably important, but don't ask me how to actually do it.
Helen, you got your hand raised. Thanks, Anya.
Yes, it's well, in terms of connecting with me, Olga, I know Michael will put my email address, I think, into the chat box, or at some point. I have supplied that, so I'm happy for that to be out there. But you're within the same organisation, so I'm sure you can find it, but it's going to be there anyway in the chat box. Just whilst you've both been talking, Olga and Anya, just noted just a few points that comes to mind. It is a very complex area. It isn't easy. I'm not into the idea of enforcement, that's for sure. But I think what we need to do is create a supportive work environment. So I think it has to start with the matrix there that you can sort of build on. And also, I mean, just on my own personal level, working with my own colleagues and within my business, I think communicating expectations clearly. Just relating back to my contractor issue, I communicated my expectations clearly, and I would reiterate those. But also being open to having a proper conversation, and of course encouraging others to contribute. It's not, I mean, for me, whilst they're my businesses, it's not all about me. I want to hear what other people have to say. I want to hear other perspectives. It's, I haven't got it all tied up. Other people have different ideas I may not have thought about. I may have actually put them to one side in the past and not revisited. And it's nice to actually be reminded. And I think that creating an environment that makes people feel comfortable to do that is very, very important. And, we all make mistakes, or we just don't quite, get something. So I think actually, and if there's a mistake, treat it as an opportunity. I'm one of those that thinks, treat it as an opportunity to learn and move forward. And yes, so just a few ideas.
Thank you very much. And Christopher, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add a couple of points on the collaboration. Number one, which is when you collaborate, you can obviously drive much bigger outcomes, much more impactful outcomes. And a simple example from my industry would be, if you have one fund manager lobbying a company to measure, I don't know, environmental risks in this way, and another fund manager lobbying a company to measure environmental risks in that way, the company that's on the receiving end of all of this, how do they understand what they're meant to do? So there is obviously a huge amount of industry collaboration in my industry, and I would say that it is almost a necessary condition for this to be effective. It does come with some drawbacks. For instance, if I happen to think that this particular way of measuring something is the better way, but perhaps I can't convince the various colleagues or other people of the wisdom of my preferred measure, maybe I have to sacrifice a bit of perfection for the common good, as it were. And I think that is all to be encouraged. One other thing I wanted to add is the slides I showed, I published in 2019, and I published them a few years ago, looking at environmental, social, and governance, and how all that drove investor returns. Today, I showed you the sort of governance angle. The environmental angle, I have to say, there were a lot of many more messy ways of measuring environmental impact, lots of fragmented ways of showing environmental impact. And there are some pretty nebulous concepts out there which in some cases overemphasize collaboration. For instance, there are environmental indices which rank countries by the number of conferences that those countries host, and how much attendance those countries' politicians give to particular conferences. Conferences isn't the outcome we're all hoping for here; it's actual action. And I just wanted to say, in some cases, collaboration can be a form of greenwashing, and that is something we all wish to stay away from. But in general, it is a good thing.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you all, actually. May I ask a question, Michael? Is there anyone else waiting to ask one?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to bring it back a little bit to this idea of how we might produce these students who are going to change the world, really transform the world as individuals or in their own organisations. it partly relates to, I think, Michael's first question, where we've got all of these standards and frameworks by which you might sort of, people might say, oh, we've got, I had a look at them. So we've got Standard and Poor, you've got the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. So should we be looking to teach people how, through these benchmarks, that this is what sustainability is about? Should we be looking at it as should it be driven by a particular function in an organization? I don't think so. But I mean, should we be saying, oh, this is a strategic issue, so which we should teach it through strategy? How do we go about this? Because it's clearly there. What we don't want, as I think, as you've said, Christopher, is we don't want a tick box exercise to say our curriculum. Ah, look, we've covered a little bit on this on SDG 3. We've covered it here. We've covered it there. But these things are all interrelated, and I guess the frameworks and the benchmarks are intended to demonstrate that the complexity of that. What do we start with? Is it functional? Is it about? Should we say, oh well, let's prioritize the environment, or what do we do? Any ideas? I might even throw that out to the audience there if anybody's got some from amongst there. Does anybody want to sort of have a first stab at that? Oh, Olga, thank you.
Hi, Liz. From my perspective, I am focusing on green HRM. So normally this type of activities are led in an organization, normally led either by an environmental manager, or by HR specialist. So if this type of tasks, normally it would be ideal to have this role formalized, and the facilitation would be done by a person who is also dedicated and also gets enough time, because it's a lot of work behind it. So it's up to the organization to decide to what I would not say function, because it's very managerial, but it should be definitely either an environmental manager, which most probably for higher education is not appropriate, or an HR specialist who is leading, for example, such processes for towards sustainability. This is
okay.
how.
Okay, so that's an HR view on these things, and I guess if you identify someone, then you have accountability. That's the benefit of that approach. There's accountability there. And yet, when you look at how all of these goals are integrated, if you're in an organization that's trying to transform, then maybe there's an argument for saying it should be with the change. People looking at it from a change point of view, or somebody might look at it and say, actually, this is about innovation. We need to innovate our business. So I'm kind of wondering whether or not, Christopher, these frameworks are useful, because again, you've got these, you talked about indices. And so I was reading somewhere that Tesla dropped out of the Standard and Poor's index, and then it's back in there again. And I'm wondering to what extent organizations can quickly do something to suddenly be seen to be more sustainable again, and what that means for who takes on these challenges, and how do we get the results that we're trying to drive? Is it frameworks? Is it by accountability in an area? What do organizations really need to do?
So I went to a business school 25 years ago, and the kind of core bread and butter of it was often based around sort of net present value calculations, discounted cash flow types of calculations. And one wonders, as time has gone by, maybe there are other frameworks, general skills like those, which can actually be applied more generally in life to help people make sustainability. And if you think about a discounted cash flow type of a framework, it's all about a trade-off between jam today and jam tomorrow. Ultimately, it's about the trade-offs of investing today to get a benefit tomorrow. There are very similar frameworks out there for carbon as well, and how you can measure carbon today in terms of carbon savings tomorrow. Equally, there are frameworks out there for measuring, for instance, carbon across whole supply chains, which could be taught about how you go about doing that. What are the standards, even if these are done just at the introductory level, simply to make people aware of the existence of these frameworks, in the same way that not everyone uses a discounted cash flow in their everyday life, but it's nice to know that is a framework which you can go and use should you wish to. Going to your question of indices, yes, I think it's great to see the indices out there. I think all indices have their problems. There's no one perfect measure. Again, a great discussion that business schools could use is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of particular ways of measuring things. We don't want to encourage in our students a box ticking type of culture. Just because it's in one measure and not in another doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing. So to teach people to look beyond what's just on the lid to what are actually the good and potentially bad things that are going on behind there. I think that is all good stuff. I wouldn't put any one index on a pedestal, but I think it is very good to teach people to look inside the box, as it were.
Thank you. Michael.
Yes, and just to touch on the topic of how do we teach students, I was looking at some of our OU modules where you see also a range of possibilities, very good work going on in different ways. So we have a level 3 third-year undergraduate module with a very strong focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and UN Global Compact, and where students are then taught to analyze a range of companies and try to map them across these different indicators, which of the sustainable development goals they are addressing very well and which ones they are not necessarily addressing very well. And all of that then fit in later on into the starting to think about the strategies of those companies and the extent to which their approach to sustainability is at the core of their strategy. We have some other modules as well, one that I was involved in, and I see a few of my module team colleagues on the list here, third year enterprise and innovation module, where sustainability was at the core, in the sense of even the title, sustainable enterprise and innovation. So we have even the assessments, students have to demonstrate sustainability. There are some activities there where students are even asked to construct their own index based on the sectors that they are analyzing, because students come from different sectors and we try to group them into what we call ideal sectors, 3 different types for the purposes of learning. So in some ways, there is very good work going on, and part of the debate we have been having is how do you incorporate or integrate all of that in a qualification, across a qualification? Would that be on a module by module basis or at the level of the qualification?
Thank you very much. Helen, you have your hand up twice.
Oh,
Both hands up.
oh, right, okay,
It's
let me
okay.
take that down.
Bang, bang.
Yes, yeah, enormous issues around frameworks, indices. It's the difficulty in actually creating them. How do you choose a social value measurement framework, etc. How do you produce something that is actually fairly representative of the private, public, voluntary community sector? The issue over qualitative, quantitative, before yes, they do reduce to a tick box exercise. Something that concerns me is how do you capture that within, say, voluntary community organizations? I think that's an enormous area to develop, and I think that is actually hugely under researched. So perhaps that's something that actually could go on maybe a to-do list going forward, because I know a lot of organizations, they're doing what they can. And if there was an opportunity perhaps to make something a little bit more transparent, to have support to do that, that can also feed into the all-important funding streams, which increasingly ask very, very specific questions around that. So again, for me, that's an enormous area of possibility to develop.
Anya, did you want to comment?
To be honest, I think everything's already said, so I will keep quiet on this one.
Okay. We have time for maybe one more question, and then I'm going to hand back to Michael to sort of conclude proceedings for today. But we're doing really well with time. I'm going to take that as indicative of my excellent chairing skills, Michael. Not. Does anybody have a burning question they'd like to ask? Michael.
I have a question that someone had asked me to ask who was not able to attend. And the question is, what are the research gaps? Helen, you've mentioned what frameworks are there that voluntary sector can use. And I think another question that has come up is whether collaboration should be enforced with respect to sustainability, and what are the circumstances under which enforcing is the best substance of enforcing. So for the panel members, then can you think of one area that you think there's not much you are seeing, which for researchers would be of interest, and maybe that might be something to pick up in the future with you guys.
I'm going to let Helen say she's already suggested one, unless you've got another one, Helen.
Well, I think going across all courses for institutions to actually take this whole sustainability topic and actually, look right across the course field. I know we're looking at enormous amount of work, but then, the issues are just absolutely eye-watering. So I think, yes, for the discomfort of having to revisit so many different, deliveries, I think it's there. It needs to be within the warp and weft of everything, not, as I said in my presentation earlier, it's not a bolt-on. So I think, that revisiting, and I know I've just thrown a huge amount of potential work into the field there, but I just think it's too important not to.
Thank you. Anya. Oh, you're on mute, Anya. Thank you.
I've just noticed, thank you. I think this is not a specific research gap, because there is actually quite a lot of work that's been done, and I'm not over all of the areas to suggest that this is a specific gap for somebody to fill in an individual project. What is becoming increasingly clear to me, and to not just to me, but mostly to other people from whom I then pick this up, is that we will need technological solutions or technological approaches. We will need social approaches. We will need changes in consumption. We will need changes in governance. We will need changes in the way in which economic systems are organized, in the way organizations are organized, because they're sort of surprisingly undemocratic and uncollaborative entities very often. So I think from an organization perspective is actually indeed, how could one run an organization differently so that more collaboration, more sustainability oriented action is actually possible. But on a wider aspect, I think one of the big challenges is also to understand more about how these different areas of action fit together. Technology, social, organizational, it's not necessary. Well, yeah, I think, and then the basics of, actual environmental understanding or knowledge. There's a ton of stuff out there on technology. There's a ton of stuff out there on what the scientific consensus is on certain topics. But I don't think that, so if you listen to people speak, so we had a conversation on the future of agriculture on Friday evening, and there was actually a former head of the NFU there, and he was all for technology. So he wanted to have all the cows in big sheds so we could take the the methane out of the, it's probably technologically not necessarily a bad idea, but it doesn't fit with animal welfare. It doesn't fit with and it also seemed to lead to a further intensification and industrialization of agriculture, which has, as one of the farmers present pointed out, has the very unintended consequence of further concentrating agricultural power and wealth in the hands of a handful of big agribusinesses. So how can we think better, not in the technological silo or only looking at, you know, what us social scientists do, sort of looking at the stuff of how about people's values and how they forge relationships, etc. But where can this stuff come together? And I know there's research out there, it's not my area, but bringing more of that together to me seems an important area for academic research.
Thank you, Anya. Christopher, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. The question on research, I'm probably not quite close enough to, but I would just again highlight the skills in the teaching, which was a part of a last question. So in other words, looking at generalizing not just accounting norms, financial accounting norms in a business school, but also energy and environmental accounting norms. I think is a really useful thing that business schools can do. I think that is something which should in general be encouraged. It may also include research. Going on from that, the slides I showed were essentially trying to highlight how this can be a win-win. The whole sustainability agenda is a win-win, and in particular, I was using governance as the example of how well-governed, well-regulated industries, well-governed companies, well-regulated industries can thrive in every sense of the term. Not everyone agrees with me. In fact, right now, the London Stock Exchange has out for consultation a paper lowering the governance standards of the main indices in the UK, main FTSE 100, etc. indices in the UK. And some would say that, you know, the UK right now has a poor performing stock market, partly because it demands too much of its companies. And I guess, you know, that's an open topic, isn't it? Which is ripe for research. And I'm on one side of that debate, to be clear. I'm on the view that governance is generally a good thing, but it is clear that not everyone shares that view.
And I think it's a debate that's reared its ugly head and come back to bite people in the States at the moment, hasn't it? BlackRock.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have been fascinated to listen to all these points of views. Thank you so much to our contributions. Thank you for the questions. Michael, I'm going to give you the last word just to close, because I'm sure people are curious to know where we go from here. What might be next for this particular subject area or even for webinar themes. So over to you to close. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Liz, for sharing and making sure that we are on time. And to all the panel, the speakers as well, thank you very much for your time. So that's a hard question in terms of where to go next. But as a department, so our Department for Public Leadership and Social Enterprise, we've started a seminar series, and that is going to continue next academic year. So hopefully the sustainability agenda will stay as part of that. The second point to make there is also from Anya's perspective, where we are looking at the business school's sustainability strategy. And all these discussions is part of us understanding what we should be focusing on, both in terms of embedding sustainability into the business school strategy, but also in terms of our external engagement. So today is very useful because we have two of our visiting fellows, Christopher and Helen. So this is also an opportunity for us to share knowledge between academics in the department and practitioners that they are collaborating with as visiting fellows. So hopefully this can stimulate some ideas around publications, both in academic and non-academic outlets, research funding bids that we might be developing, which might be of interest to you or might benefit from your insights, and also some of the content coming out of this that can be beneficial for our modules as well. And talking about that, we have our Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership and Social and Sustainable Enterprise Cluster, which you might have seen in the advert. And I'm going to put the details of the center directors here for those who might who are attending this seminar, who might want to follow up with them on any project. Fidel and Akil. And I think that's all from me. So the recording of the webinar will be uploaded in the Center for Voluntary Sector Leadership and the Social and Sustainable Enterprise Cluster. So look out in those two websites for more information, and then we keep the conversation going.
Thank you very much. Bang on time, everyone. Once again, thank you to the panel. Thank you for joining us. Please do listen again to it and send the links to other people. Let's spread the word and keep the conversation going. Thank you very much, everyone. And bye for now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Very good, Michael. That was very interesting. I think lots of ideas there, tons of ideas. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yes, tons of ideas there. So
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you very much.
Okay, good stuff. All righty. I'll speak to you tomorrow.
Great. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.